Hello learners, welcome to the Postgraduate Diploma in Environmental and Occupational Health. In this module, we will discuss about genetically modified organisms, which forms a part of the course MEVE 003, that is Agriculture and Allied Sectors. I introduce myself as Dr. Sushmita Bhaskar, working at Indira Gandhi National Open University, New Delhi. Now, people have been altering the genomes of plants and animals for many years, and this includes using the traditional breeding techniques. Artificial selection for example, specific and desired trait that has resulted in a variety of the different organisms. Now, this artificial selection in which the organisms are exhibiting some specific traits, these are normally chosen so that they can breed for the subsequent generations, and that has been limited to the natural occurring variations. Now, we have seen there are several advances in the field of genetic engineering, and that has allowed for precise control over the genetic changes that are introduced into an organism. That means we can incorporate new genes from one species into a completely unrelated species, and that is through the technique which is known as genetic engineering. Here we can optimize the agricultural performance, facilitate the production of valuable pharmaceutical substances, for example certain vaccines. And some of the examples include the crop plants, the farm animals, soil bacteria, all these organisms that have been subject to the genetic engineering techniques. Now, the objectives after listening to this module, you will be able to define the concept and the principle behind the genetically modified crops, describe some methods that are used in the production of genetically modified crops, comprehend the safety and the ethical issues related to the production and utilization of these genetically modified crops, and let us also list some of the competent authorities that are dealing with the regulation of these genetically modified organisms in India, our country. So, coming on to the first point, what are genetically modified crops? Any plant, animal or microorganism in which a desired DNA, that is deoxyribonucleic acid, this from the different organisms has been inserted for the improvement of certain traits, that we can refer to as genetically modified crop. Now, these GMO, that is the genetically modified organisms, they have a novel combination of genetic material that are created for human consumption by using the molecular biology techniques. Let us cite an example, that is of vitamin A deficiency. This can result from inadequate intake, it can be due to fat malabsorption or even certain liver disorder. Even when we are having some problem and the gut is unable to absorb the essential nutrients, that can also result in the vitamin A deficiency. So, what happens in the case of deficiency? It will impair your immunity and the hematopoietic system, that is the blood disorders, and it can also cause certain type of rashes and typical eye disorders, that is the ocular effects. Now, some examples are the xerophthalmia and also night blindness. This is most common in the developing countries, for example in Asia and also the Southeast Asian countries. So, millions of people here, especially in the developing countries, they have the vitamin A deficiency. And this is also a serious public health threat in parts of Asia, and it is a leading cause of childhood blindness. So, what are the treatments that can be administered? Mainly they include supplements and also certain amount of diet changes. So, golden rice, this was an example of a GM crop, and many scientists and humanitarians, they believe that this global rice, this golden rice, this could be a novel solution and it could work as magic, and it can also help a number of these million people who have this problem of the vitamin A deficiency. In 2021, the Philippines government, they approved the golden rice varieties for the cultivation. But there are many of the NGOs, there is a non-governmental organization and also the people's movement, they have all opposed to these genetically modified food. For example, even the Greenpeace organization, they claim that this golden rice, it is ineffective, it is unnecessary, and they can also pose risk to the human health and also to the environment. So, in this figure you can see the normal rice and this golden rice, the color appears golden or yellow in color because that has a high content of beta carotene and it is really rich, which is helping in this vitamin A deficiency. So, this kind of technology this genetically modified organism production or the genetic engineering techniques, it is also known as recombinant DNA technology or genetic engineering, and the resulting organism is said to be genetically modified. So, these plants that have been modified in the laboratory, and they have been to introduce the noble and the desired traits, such as it can be due to increased resistance to the herbicides or improved nutritional content. So, you can take the desired trait that is required for your experiment, and then these crops or the plants can be modified accordingly. Traditionally, the enhancement of these desired trait that has been undertaken through breeding, and the conventional breeding techniques, these are time consuming, but the genetic engineering technique, they can create the organism with the exact desired trait very rapidly and also with great accuracy. Let us go on to a brief history of these GM crops. In GMO, this actually attracted a large amount of the media attention, and the first genetically modified organism that was made by Herbert Boyer and Stanley Cohen in the year 1973. They basically took a gene from a bacterium which provided resistance to an antibiotic, and then they inserted this into a vector organism and then induced another bacterium to uptake the plasmid. So, the transformed or genetically modified bacterium that was then able to survive in the presence of an antibiotic. In 1974, a transgenic mouse was also created by introducing a foreign DNA into its embryo, making this as the world's first genetically modified animal. Then some more examples are the first GM crop that was produced in 1982, that was a tobacco plant which was genetically modified with an antibiotic resistance gene. This was also developed through tissue culture techniques, and that is by infecting tobacco with agrobacterium with an antibiotic resistance gene. So, thus this new or modified GM tobacco plant that which was obtained was able to grow into a new plant containing this resistance gene. Again, the first genetically engineered tobacco plant was found to be resistant to the direct application of the herbicides and to resist the insects. So, a lot of the trial experiments were performed to develop the plants resistant to viral diseases and also to several fungal diseases, and these experiments are also in progress. Also, some more traits which were given focus was that of modification, like the delaying in the ripening, enhancement of the starch content, so on. And in 1985, the first transgenic livestock was also produced after experimentation. China also became the first country to commercialize the transgenic plants by introducing a virus resistant tobacco in 1992, and in the same year the first genetically modified corn was approved for use by the US Food and Drug Administration. Therefore, currently a number of food crops like the soybean, then the corn, cotton, then tomato, Hawaiian papaya, then potatoes, canola, sugarcane, sugar beet, field corn, and also certain varieties of rice, they have all been genetically modified to enhance their yield, the grain size, the durability, and the nutritional contents. The first biotechnologically produced food ingredient was chymosin, that is an agent that helps in the clotting of milk clot during the production of cheese. So, these are several examples. Then some more was the European Union in 1994. They also approved the GM tobacco, making it the first genetically engineered crop that was commercialized in Europe. An insect resistant potato was also approved for release in USA in the year 1995, and by 96 the approval had been granted to commercially grow 8 types of the transgenic crops and 1 flower crop in the 6 countries plus the European Union. So, therefore, the commercialization of the GM food, it started in 1996 by 6 countries, and some of the major producers of these crops include the United States of America, Argentina, Brazil, Canada, China, Paraguay, South Africa, and some of these are the countries mentioned. Therefore, it is clear that since the GMOs have been introduced, it has become a huge part of the crop industry. But we should also understand the effects the GMOs have on our environment, and also whether it is safe to be used for the human health. So, in 2010, the scientists also announced that they had created the first synthetic bacterial genome, and it was the world's first synthetic life form. And this commercialized genetically modified animal, it was known as a zebrafish, and that had a fluorescent gene that was added which allowed it to glow in the dark and when it is seen under the UV light. So therefore, in a genetically modified organism, it is basically an organism whose genetic makeup has been directly altered by the human beings. So the living organisms, biochemical, anatomical, physiological and the behavioral trait, all this is determined by the genetic information that is encoded in the DNA. The process of the genetic modification, that involves identifying the portions of the DNA that are responsible for a particular trait in one organism, copying these DNA sequences and then introducing them into a different organism. It could be directly using the vectors such as bacteria and or the viruses. Traditionally, many of these characteristics of these domestic animals and the agricultural crop, they have been modified by using the selective breeding techniques. For example, we had two species of the grass family. You had the wheat family and also the rye variety. And both are selectively bred together to form a hybrid offspring that have the ruggedness of the rye and it has a high yield of the wheat. So like this, they have been done a lot of experimenting. But the GMO crops, they are produced using the modern genetics and they are using recombinant DNA technology. And definitely it is improving the plants and animals for the production of the food. So we have already seen that the genes are cut and then from the plants or the animals that have a desired trait, and then they are pasted or inserted into at precise locations, and then you are getting the desired or the beneficial effect. And then the organism that is produced by such methods, that is called as a genetically modified or genetically engineered or transgenic organism. So a variety of the GM crops have the novel traits and they have been also released for the commercial agriculture production. Here some examples are the herbicide resistant soybean, pest resistant cotton, maize, canola, resistant potatoes and also of the papaya species. In addition, various transgenic crops are under development with the traits, for example phytoremediation techniques and also production of the pharmaceuticals such as bananas with the vaccines. Then the commercial cultivation of the transgenic crops, this also started in the early 1990s. Now let us see some important methods that are involved in the GM organism production. So these methods involve the physical, chemical and the biological methods, and they include the gene gun method or biolistics, microinjection method, electroporation and agrobacterium mediated transformation. Now in the gene guns, they shoot the target genes into the plant cells. This is a most common method where the DNA is bound to the tiny particles of gold or tungsten, and then they are shot into the plant tissue or the single plants under a high pressure. Then the accelerated particles, they penetrate into the cell wall and the membranes, and the DNA will separate from the metal and it is integrated into the plant DNA inside the nucleus. So this method has been applied successfully for many of the cultivated crops like wheat or maize. But the disadvantage is that it can, because of the high pressure, it can cause serious damage to the cellular tissue. The next is agrobacterium tumefaciens mediated transformation. So this is also a natural plant parasite and that has an ability to transfer the genes. In electroporation, here it is used when the plant tissue does not contain the cell wall. So electric pulses are used to create the miniature pore in the plant cell through which the DNA is entering. Then we have microinjection. This is used to directly inject the foreign DNA into the cells. Now let us see some of the safety and the ethical issues associated with the GM crop. So it is rare that the genes may transfer from the plant to the disease causing bacteria through the food chain, and the vast majority of the research based on these GM organisms, they suggest that they are safe to eat and that they have also the potential to feed the millions of the starving people worldwide. But scientists do advise that genes which determine the resistance to antibiotics that are critical for treating the humans, they should not be used in the genetically modified plants. So there are pros and the cons. Food items made of the genetically modified crop, for example, that are currently available, which we mentioned even before, that have been judged safe to eat in some of the countries. But lack of evidence of the negative effect does not mean that these new or genetically modified food are without risk. So scientists recommend that a food safety assessment should be taking place on a case-to-case basis before this GMO is also brought into the market. Again, there is also certain controversies arising whether certain genetically modified plants which are insect resistant because they carry the Bt gene, that is Bacillus thuringiensis, that could harm not only the insect pest but also the other species such as the useful species, for example in the case of the monarch butterfly. So therefore, continued monitoring of such effects is also required in the ecosystems. Then the genetically modified crop, they can also have indirect environmental effects due to changing agricultural or the environmental practices. So it remains controversial whether the net effect of these changes will be positive or negative for the environment and also for the human health. So many of the environmental organizations and the public interest groups, they have been actively protesting against the GM foods, and this has been going on for years. However, the broad consensus is that the environmental effects of the genetically modified plants should be evaluated using science-based assessment procedures, considering each crop individually in comparison to its conventional counterpart. So we need to take the safety assessment into account. The CBD, that is the Convention on Biological Diversity. This is concerned with the conservation and sustainable use of the ecosystem but also with the environmental effects of these GMOs. A part of this convention is the Cartagena Protocol on Biosafety, and this regulates the export and import of the genetically modified crops. So this Cartagena Protocol on Biosafety, this came into force in 2003 and it has been ratified by 161 countries. The objective, as stated, is to contribute to ensure an adequate level of protection in the field of the safe transfer, handling and use of the living modified organisms resulting from modern biotechnology that may have adverse effects on the conservation and sustainable use of biological diversity, taking into account risk to human health and specifically focusing on transboundary movements. For the host of these countries, it is also mandatory to label the products, that is, the GM labels are required that use the GM ingredients. So many of the environmental activists, religious organizations, public interest group and other scientists and government officials, they have raised their concerns about these GM foods. Therefore, the safety assessment of the GMO is very important. Now, the status of these GM food is controversial, and then the subject of protest and scientific disputes are also going on. The controversies involve the governmental regulators, the consumers, the biotechnology, the non-governmental organizations and also the scientists. But basically the key areas that they are focusing on include the effect of GM crops on the human health and environment, impact on the farmers, labeling of the GM food and also role of the government regulators. GM crop labeling, this is required in many of the countries, and therefore the ethical issues concerned with the use of the GM crop, that includes violation of the natural organisms' intrinsic values and tampering with nature by mixing the genes among the different species. So let us now see, do the GM foods have to be labeled? GM food and the ingredient, including the food additive and the processing aid that contain a novel DNA or novel protein, they must be labeled with the words genetically modified in apostrophe words. Novel DNA and the novel protein, that means the DNA or the protein which as a result of the use of gene technology is different in chemical sequence or structure from DNA or protein that is present in the counterpart food that has not been produced using the gene technology other than the protein that is used as a processing aid or used as a food additive and has an amino acid sequence that is found in nature. So for example, in Australia and in New Zealand, all the GM food and the ingredient, they must undergo a safety assessment and they have to be approved before they can be sold in the markets. So GM labeling is helping the consumers to make an informed choice about the food that they buy, because we normally see the labels before we buy anything, and in that label it should be written genetically modified soya bean or soya flour and in brackets genetically modified. So the GM food that do not contain any novel DNA or novel protein and that which does not contain any altered characteristic, that does not require a GM labeling. What about the status of the GMOs in India? So in India, it is very supportive of the transgenic plant research. BT cotton is an important crop of India, and this suffers great crop loss because of the susceptibility to the insect pest, that is the cotton industry. And therefore, the cotton plant was genetically modified with a pest resistance gene, that is from the bacterium Bacillus thuringiensis (BT). Now, this BT cotton is a genetically modified cotton variety and it has a high resistivity to the bollworm, that is a major pest of the cotton. In 2011, India celebrated a decade of successful cultivation of the BT cotton that also achieved phenomenal success in transforming this cotton crop into the most productive and the profitable crop in the industry. But the use of BT crop, of course, it increases the yield of cotton due to the effective control of these pests and also reduction in the application of the insecticide for its cultivation. It also causes a reduction in the cost of cultivation and decrease in environmental pollution because the amount of the insecticide used is less. But it also has certain limitations like the high cost of these seeds when compared to the non-BT cotton seed, and then the effectiveness of only up to 120 days, maybe 3 to 4 months, after which the toxin producing efficiency that will drastically reduced. Then excessive use of these BT cotton that can lead to the loss of the genetic diversity. It can also develop resistance among the pest and also illegal BT cotton seed marketing, and this has affected the farmers, and you would have seen that the farmers also went into depression and they went also to take up to certain fatal steps due to all these problems. In the same way, BT brinjal, that is a Solanum melongena. This is the fourth most important vegetable grown after potato, onion and tomato in India. This is an indigenous vegetable plant to India and a home to a vast number of the varieties. Today, if we see, brinjal contributes to 8% of the vegetable production in our country, and it is also a widely consumed vegetable. It is beneficial for the human health because it has high amounts of fiber, water, it is rich in the antioxidants, and also it is a good source of the vitamins and minerals. So, the eggplant farmers, they also they succumb to a lot of the yield loss up to even 73% annually due to the fruit and the shoot borer disease which affects these brinjal plants. So, the farmers were mainly relying on the application of the chemical pesticide in order to control this FSB, and that involved indiscriminate use of the pesticides, and that was causing the multiple side effect both on environment and also the human health. So, due to this, the use of BT brinjal was used, and that was giving the insect resistance and selective advantage to the plant and increasing its ability to survive and reproduce in these conditions. Now, a gazette notification in India from the Ministry of Consumer Affairs, this makes it mandatory for the packaged foods from the GM foods as ingredients to carry the GM labels from January 1st, 2013, and the notification was out on in 2012. So, the environmental and health impacts of the genetically modified food, they have been debated all over the world and in the last few years especially. In a report that is by the Earth Open Source, that was a non-profit organization in London in 2012, this pointed out the risk with the cultivation and consumption of the GM food. So, the report showed how the methods of the genetic engineering that can be unpredictable and in their outcome, and that can also induce toxicity and also allergenicity. Some of the competent authorities that are dealing with the regulation of GMO in India include the Genetic Engineering Approval Committee, Recombinant DNA Advisory Committee, Review Committee on Genetic Manipulation, Institutional Biosafety Committees, State Biotechnology Coordination Committee and district level committees. The possible benefits of the GM crops, since we have listed some of them, it has increased nutritional value and definitely they have a better taste and greater nutrient. The farmers can grow more crops on less land and they contain additional nutrients which are normally lacking in the common grown varieties. Then they have increased crop yield and protection from the biotic and the abiotic environmental stressors. For example, they can withstand drought, salinity, presence of aluminum or heavy metals in the environment. Example is an anti-freeze gene from cold water fish. This has been introduced into plants such as tobacco and potato, and with this anti-freeze gene, these plants are able to tolerate the cold temperatures normally, that is in a very normal manner. Then application in the pharmaceuticals. So, they can produce vaccines or other medicines. Potatoes have been modified to produce edible vaccines against E. coli that cause diarrhea. This would allow the cheap and easy distribution of the vaccine. Reduction in herbicide and the pesticide use. So here again you can have a lesser amount of the pesticides or the herbicides that are being sprayed and reduce the environmental impacts. Then it can help in combating the climate change impact. So in addition to this technology, it has reduced the greenhouse gas emission, and originally that is caused by the conventional ways of the farming. So emission of greenhouse gas, that is also a huge detrimental factor to the environment. The United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, they estimate that the world will have to grow 70% or more food by the year 2050 just to keep up with the population growth, the booming growth. So climate change will also make much of the world's arable land more difficult to farm. So therefore this genetic modified crop or this technology that can produce higher yield, it can grow in the dry and the salty land, and it can withstand high and low temperature, tolerate the insects, disease, and also certain herbicides. The possible risk of using the GM crop: as we are using the GMO more frequent, the weeds have developed a resistance to the herbicide. So in order to increase the use of herbicide, we have to control these weeds, and this can again cause a negative effect on the environment. Then it can also cause leakage of the GM protein into the soil that may have an effect on the useful bacteria, the microbial interactions and beneficial interactions which are going on in the soil. So that can inadvertently lead to the toxicity of the normal flora and the fauna. Then the non-GM crops that could be contaminated by the spread of the genetically modified trait by wind and also insect cross-pollination. So once these traits are then entering the agricultural gene pool, then we cannot remove them. Another negative impact is that the GMO has the potential of disturbing the natural ecosystem. The use of herbicide resistant corn and soya bean, that is, raises the possibility of outcrossing, which can again lead to development of more aggressive weed or herbicide resistant wild relatives of these contaminated, these cultivated plants. The use of herbicides also has an indirect effect on animal development. For example, in this figure you can see the tadpoles. Certain amphibians including tadpole, certain part of their life cycle is completed in the aquatic habitat, for example in the first few months. And then so these when they are in this aquatic ecosystem, they can be directly affected by the GM crop when they are blown into the waters. Then when they digest these crops which are blown into the water, then their growth and development can also be greatly affected. Then these GM crops may be a threat to other species of the insects. For example, BT176, the transgenic component in BT corn, that can produce the pollen that is highly toxic to the monarch larvae and other butterfly species. Human health risk is mainly allergenicity. Many children worldwide, they have developed life-threatening allergies to the peanut and other food. So there is a possibility that when you introduce a gene into a plant, that may create an allergen reaction in susceptible individuals. Then therefore the extensive testing of the GM food is required in order to avoid the possibility of harm to the consumers who have certain food allergies. Unknown effects on human health is also there. That causes a growing concern that introducing such foreign genes into the food plant, that may have unexpected and negative impacts on the human health. Therefore, it is very important to develop the technical capacity and expertise to regulate the use of GM crop in the developing countries. Scientists cannot declare any technology completely risk-free. The GM crop that can reduce some environmental risk associated with traditional agriculture, but it will also impose new challenges that needs to be addressed. So my dear learners, in this module we have learnt about the genetically modified organisms, the genetically modified crops especially, and the techniques that are involved in the gene technology and in these biotechnology techniques. And we have also seen some of the advantages and some of the health impacts and the negative impacts that are caused also on the ecosystem, and the impacts on the environment that causes a raise of concern. And I hope you have had a good understanding of this module. Thank you for your patient listening.